Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Utah Transfer of Public Lands Movement, an introduction to the expanded content in the downloadable Transfer of Public Lands Movement Study Guide available on our website. Go to www.lwvutah.org and click on What We Do to find our studies. The Transfer of Public Lands Movement Study explores how the U.S. public lands came to be and what they provide both economically and culturally, and the consequences to the future of these lands and public access to them if the Transfer of Public Lands Movement succeeds in obtaining transfer of U.S. public lands into state ownership. To better understand the organized attempt by transfer proponents to develop a narrative supporting their objectives, this study also examines the actions being advanced by those who would claim state ownership of U.S. public lands. The U.S. public lands, acquired from Great Britain east of the Mississippi River and through war, treaty, or purchase from other European powers west of the Mississippi River, stretch from the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Of the 1.8 billion acres of public land acquired by the United States, 2/3 were given or sold to individuals, corporations, or to the states. What remained has been set aside for a variety of purposes. Those purposes include oil and gas development, timber harvesting, grazing, mining, and more recently, wind and solar energy development. But they also include water resource protection, wildlife habitat and carbon sequestration, hunting and fishing, hiking and camping, four-wheel driving, and river running, along with other educational, spiritual, and recreational uses. Of the 1.8 billion acres of public land once owned by the United States, about 640 million acres remain, most of them in the West. The lands in the public domain are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Transfer of Public Lands movement is an extension of the Sagebrush Rebellion of the 1970s and 80s that sought major changes to federal land control, use, and disposal policy in western states, where U.S. public lands include between 20% and 85% of a state's area. Supporters of this movement want more state and local control over these lands, if not outright transfer of them to state and local authorities and/or privatization. Utah is currently at the epicenter of an organized effort to transfer the public lands owned by all Americans into state ownership that could then be a model for other states to follow. Utah elected officials and other proponents of the transfer movement are providing the public with information based on alternative legal theories and language from Utah's Enabling Act that is not found in the Act. They are utilizing state taxes to pursue a goal of state takeover of U.S. public lands in Utah, and have been working with members of Congress to undermine U.S. public lands nationwide. The public lands targeted by proponents of the Transfer of Public Lands movement are primarily Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and the U.S. Forest Service, USFS, managed lands, but in Utah also include land under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Utah portion of the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, which is part of the National Park Service. In addition, there's a concerted effort to undermine or abolish the Antiquities Act of 1906, which has been used by numerous presidents from both parties to set aside national monuments, many of which have become national parks. In Utah, 4 of the mighty 5 national parks began as presidentially proclaimed national monuments. Without the Antiquities Act, they could have ended up in private ownership. So what lands in Utah are currently part of the U.S. public domain and owned by all Americans with public access for future generations? Public lands in Utah include the following: 6 national forests, initially created for watershed protection and timber harvesting, but now include recreation and wilderness. 5 national parks, 4 of which were created using the Antiquities Act and then later designated national parks by acts of Congress. 8 national monuments set aside using the Antiquities Act of 1906 to protect archaeological sites, historic landmarks, and other objects of historic or scientific interest located on federal land. In 2017, President Trump issued proclamations reducing the size of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and the Bears Ears National Monument. Various groups have sued to block these proclamations, arguing that the president exceeded his authority under the Antiquities Act. Utah's public lands also include 2 national recreation areas, one of which is being targeted by advocates of the transfer movement. 3 national wildlife refuges, which are managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, whose lands the transfer advocates are also looking to obtain. 31 national wilderness areas set aside under the Wilderness Act of 1964 that allows Congress to designate wilderness areas to ensure that America's pristine wildlands will not disappear. Wilderness areas can be part of national parks, national wildlife refuges, national forests, or public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Public lands in Utah also include 18 national recreation trails designated under the National Trails System Act of 1968, which authorized creation of a national system of trails comprised of national recreation trails, national scenic trails, and national historic trails, which includes 523 miles of national historic trails in Utah and 1 national historic site, the Golden Spike National Historic Site, which celebrates the completion of the nation's first transcontinental railroad. Public lands also include 8 national scenic byways, which are roads recognized by the United States Department of Transportation for 1 or more of 6 intrinsic qualities: archaeological, cultural, historic, natural, recreational, and scenic. 2 national conservation areas managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And the Bureau of Land Management lands, from which most of all of these other land designations originated, when the Public Lands Agency was known as the General Land Office, created in 1812 to deal with the expanding U.S. public domain, and after 1946, known as the Bureau of Land Management. The League of Women Voters of Utah is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. It works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Thank you for your time.